In 1998, amid the crowded streets of New York City and the pervasive illusion of safety in a city that had just emerged from its dark era, a 5-year-old boy vanished in just a few short minutes. No cries for help, no signs of violence, no witness who could confidently say they had seen anything. For more than 2 decades afterward, his family lived in a limbo between hope and despair, while the child himself grew up somewhere in the heart of America, under a different name, with no birth certificate, no records, completely unaware that he had once been at the center of a disappearance that shocked the entire city. The police file grew cold over the years, witnesses' memories distorted, 1998 technology proved powerless, and the truth was buried beneath investigative decisions that never had a chance to be corrected. But blood doesn't forget blood, DNA doesn't lie, and some connections, even when severed, silently persist, waiting for the right moment to surge forth like a bolt of lightning tearing through the silence. Today, I will plunge you straight into the heart of a cold case that spanned more than 20 years, where a child disappeared in broad daylight, a family that never stopped searching, and a question that forced the entire system to confront at what exact moment was the truth missed. Before diving deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. New York City in 1998 carried a distinctive atmosphere of the post-crime crisis era. The city was still crowded, noisy, and constantly in motion, but the fear that had enveloped the early 1990s had gradually receded, giving way to a widespread belief that everyday life had become safer, especially in middle-class neighborhoods in Manhattan, where families believed that being in a crowd made danger unlikely. The Upper West Side was one such area, with its familiar apartment buildings, small cafes, schools, and parks along the Hudson River, where children appeared every day as an inseparable part of the urban landscape. The Miller family had lived there for many years, in a modest but stable apartment, with a regular daily routine and no signs of instability that would draw attention from neighbors or friends. Daniel Miller, Ethan's father, worked in finance, leaving the house every morning at the same time, while Laura Miller, the boy's mother, had a part-time job and spent most of her day with her only son. Ethan Miller, 5 years old at the time, was a true city kid, accustomed to the sound of traffic, used to walking on crowded sidewalks, familiar with going out with adults without needing to hold hands the whole way. The boy was small in stature, with light brown hair that often fell over his forehead, a bright and energetic face, particularly curious about everything happening around him. Ethan liked to walk a few steps ahead, and then turn back to look at the adults, liked to stop at trivial details like a dog being walked or a street performer, and was easily drawn in by the voice of a stranger if it suggested friendliness. The person with Ethan that day was Laura Miller, his biological mother, who had taken him to Riverside Park on an ordinary afternoon like so many others before it, a place the mother and son had visited dozens of times, familiar enough that Laura didn't feel the need to monitor her son's every step. Between Laura and Ethan existed an absolutely close and trusting bond. Ethan was used to being allowed to run a few meters ahead, while Laura was accustomed to just glancing around to spot her son somewhere in her line of sight. The incident didn't begin with an act of violence or a clearly alarming situation, but with a tiny detail that almost went unnoticed. While Laura stopped by a bench to reorganize her bag, a strange man appeared near the play area, with no overtly unusual behavior. Just one of many adults present in the park at that time. Ethan, with his curious habit, stepped a little farther than usual, stopping at the boundary that Laura still believed she could control, and in those few brief seconds, Laura momentarily felt something was off, but quickly reassured herself that it was just an overreaction from a mother in a crowded public space. When Laura looked up next, Ethan was no longer in his familiar spot. Her first reflex wasn't panic, but calling her son's name, thinking he had just run to another area of the park, something entirely in line with Ethan's energetic personality. A few minutes passed. Laura began walking faster, searching nearby paths, asking people near the play area, but the responses were all uncertain. Some said they had just seen a boy like Ethan heading toward an exit, others couldn't clearly remember where they had seen him. There were no screams, no chaos, no signs of a struggle sufficient to draw attention from those around, and that very silence made everything harder to grasp. Laura retraced her steps, calling Ethan's name louder, the initial calm giving way to growing anxiety as her spontaneous search expanded without results. Daniel Miller was called in a state of panic, and when both realized that searching within the park and nearby paths no longer offered clear hope, they had to confront the possibility neither had dared consider before: Ethan hadn't simply wandered off. The decision to call the police was made amid the tug-of-war between fragile hope and mounting fear, marking the moment Ethan Miller was officially reported missing, and also the moment the peace the Miller family had trusted shattered in what seemed like a completely ordinary afternoon. The 911 call was made in a context where enough time had passed for anxiety to turn into urgency, and from that moment Ethan Miller's disappearance was no longer a personal fear, but an event requiring formal processing by the system. The initial information recorded through the dispatcher reflected the family's chaotic state. Time not entirely accurate, location described by familiar landmarks, but without specific coordinates, and details of the circumstances of Ethan's disappearance presented in a mix of certainty and speculation. The local police unit was dispatched to Riverside Park in a short time, approaching the area where Ethan was last seen and beginning to establish the scene according to the initial assessed severity of the case. At that point, the core question for authorities wasn't where Ethan had gone, but whether this was a case of a child getting lost in a large public space, or a disappearance involving criminal elements, and this very ambiguity shaped all the initial decision. Officers approached Laura Miller and Daniel Miller to collect preliminary statements, asking them to recount the entire day's events, from leaving the apartment to realizing Ethan was no longer in sight, while noting basic victim information such as age, appearance, clothing, and daily habit. These statements were collected under highly emotional conditions, where panic made recalling the sequence of events more difficult than usual, and that soon showed through details that didn't fully match across retellings. Police worked to establish the last confirmed sighting of Ethan, trying to pinpoint the final moment the boy was seen with certainty, not based on guesswork or inference. But right in this step, the first difficulties emerged as Laura could only estimate the time frame, based on feeling and routine rather than a specific clock time. Witnesses around the play area were approached and quickly asked if they had seen a boy matching Ethan's description, and while some thought they had seen a similar child pass through a certain area of the park, no statement was clear enough to be considered a firm confirmation. The difference between what the family recalled and what external witnesses provided quickly created multiple versions of the same time period, causing the last seen marker to stretch rather than narrow. During statement collection, police also noted the fact that no one reported hearing cries for help or witnessing a struggle, a detail that helped rule out some public violence scenarios while increasing the case's complexity with no clear signs to determine Ethan's direction of movement. Officers documented the entire surrounding area, marking main park entrances and exits, routes a 5-year-old could reach in a short time, while trying to recreate the space based on direct witness to better understand where Ethan might have been standing before vanishing. However, even in these first minutes, a key issue emerged. Time began to distort due to memory and emotion, as each witness tried to unconsciously fill gaps with speculation, while the family repeatedly returned to the same detail with varying time markers. These small discrepancies, unavoidable in emergencies, had a major impact on reconstructing the sequence, as even a few minutes' difference could open or close entirely different possibilities in a crowded urban space. Police had to record multiple time versions in parallel, categorizing them by certainty and source, while still unable to rule out any hypothesis about how Ethan left the park. That ambiguity meant the scene couldn't be established under a single scenario, and the officers present had to accept that from the start. The case had information gaps that couldn't be filled immediately. When initial intake procedures were complete, the file on Ethan Miller was officially opened as missing, with notes on inconsistencies in statements and estimated time markers, laying the foundation for an investigation that from the very first hour had to confront the reality that the truth didn't fit neatly into a simple story, but was fragmented by human memory, circumstantial chaos, and the unavoidable limits of the initial moment. Aiming to construct the most plausible sequence of events based on what could be verified, rather than the increasingly piling emotional guessing, the responsible officers began reviewing every recorded statement from Laura Miller, Daniel Miller, and those present at Riverside Park when Ethan vanished, placing information markers side by side to find intersections among memories already disrupted by stress and panic. This process quickly revealed a troubling reality: the same event recounted with differing time details, sometimes only minutes apart, but enough to completely alter understanding of what happened in that vast public space. Police had to categorize statements by certainty level, prioritizing information tied to specific actions or familiar routine markers, such as the time mother and son left the apartment, the distance traveled to the park, or the period Laura stopped by the bench before realizing Ethan was out of sight. From this data, a preliminary sequence was built, starting from Ethan's arrival at Riverside Park with his mother, continuing through the time he played in the familiar area, and ending at the moment he was no longer seen with certainty. During timeline construction, investigators tried to identify certain time markers, those confirmed by multiple independent sources or tied to actions unlikely to be misremembered, such as when Laura first called Ethan's name upon not seeing him nearby, or the exact time the 911 call was made and logged by the system. However, between those relatively clear markers was a significant gap, where data became fragmented and couldn't be arranged into a seamless chain. This gap, lasting only a few minutes by estimate, was the critical phase where no witness could provide sufficiently certain information to reconstruct, as no one could confirm seeing Ethan at that moment, nor verify which direction he went or whom he contacted. The absence of data in that brief period forced investigators to acknowledge that parts of the story couldn't be accurately recreated, despite all analytical efforts. While continuing to cross-reference statements, police noted another complicating factor: external witnesses, though well-intentioned, often provided only vague descriptions of a child like Ethan, without clear identifying features or timing, making this information hard to use as confirmation markers. The lack of violent signs, no reported cries for help or chaos in the area, further blurred pinpointing the decisive moment, as it ruled out a standout event drawing collective attention. Investigators had to work under the assumption that Ethan vanished silently, blending into the park's normal rhythm and surrounding paths, a scenario particularly hard to trace in a crowded urban environment. When the preliminary sequence was completed, despite lingering questions, police moved to initial containment, based on certain time markers and a 5-year-old's movement capability in the estimated window. This scope included the park area, main entrances, exits, adjacent streets, and spaces Ethan could reach if out of his mother's supervision for minutes. However, the unclear timing of when Ethan left the familiar area meant the containment zone couldn't narrow as desired, forcing authorities to accept a much broader search area than initially expected. In internal meetings, experienced investigators recognized the core issue wasn't lack of effort or witness goodwill, but that human memory, especially under stress, isn't a precise timing tool. Each retelling risked unconscious timeline adjustments, making seemingly minor details gradually unreliable without careful cross-checking. Building the initial timeline was thus not just a logic puzzle, but a process of accepting limits, where police had to clearly define what was reliable and what gaps had to remain open. When this step ended, they had an incomplete but sufficient picture as a foundation for next decision, while also realizing Ethan Miller's disappearance wasn't a simple story explainable by a clear event chain, but a collection of uneven pieces, where the very gaps between time markers determined the direction of the entire subsequent search process. From the still sparsely filled timeline platform, the authorities quickly shifted to the action phase with a clear awareness that every passing minute reduced the chances of finding Ethan Miller safe, and expanding the search was the only remaining option in the absence of direct lead. The New York police mobilized additional personnel from neighboring units, coordinating with rescue teams and local volunteers to launch a large-scale search operation centered on Riverside Park and surrounding areas, aiming to cover every space a 5-year-old child could reach within the estimated time since the disappearance. The park, a familiar daily spot for hundreds of families, was divided into smaller zones for systematic sweeping, from main pathways, playgrounds, lawn, to less frequented hidden corners, while other officers simultaneously expanded the scope to adjacent residential areas, checking backyards of buildings, garage entrances, apartment hallways, and public spaces that might have been overlooked in the initial minute. Searching in an urban environment quickly revealed its unique challenges. High population density caused the number of spaces to check to multiply exponentially, while constant foot traffic disturbed potential traces and made determining Ethan's direction of movement far more complicated than in rural or suburban areas. Alongside ground searches, Police also focused on the public transportation system, an unavoidable factor in New York City, where subways and buses connect nearly every part of the city. Stations near the park were inspected, operators were questioned about seeing a boy alone, and bus routes passing through the area during the suspected time frame were reviewed to the extent allowed by available timing data. However, the technological limitations of 1998 meant this checking relied mainly on human memory and manual records, rather than automated surveillance systems like those in later years, significantly reducing the accuracy of tracing. As the search expanded without clear results, teams were forced to revisit smaller details, hoping any sign, however vague, could provide a new direction. It was in this context that a personal item was discovered in an area not too far from where Ethan was last seen, a detail initially thought to potentially bring a breakthrough, but which ultimately raised more questions than answers. The item was carefully documented for location, time, and discovery conditions, then preserved according to procedure, while investigators tried to establish its connection to Ethan's disappearance. Evaluating the evidence's value quickly revealed its limitations. Though it could confirm Ethan's presence at a certain point, the item provided no clear information on subsequent movement, nor any signs of violence or coercion. Its appearance thus both reinforced the assumption that Ethan had been in the area near the time of disappearance, and highlighted the reality that the rare tangible clues were insufficient to decisively narrow the search. Meanwhile, search teams continued canvassing nearby residential areas, approaching each household and inquiring about any unusual activity that day, but most responses yielded no new information, reflecting a frightening characteristic of disappearances in crowded cities. A serious event could occur without leaving traces large enough to draw collective attention. Quick briefings were held continuously to update the situation, adjust search scopes based on what had been ruled out, and consider expanding to farther areas if necessary, even though that meant dispersing resources without a clear direction. Hour by hour, fatigue began to show on the search teams, but the pressure to maintain high intensity allowed no pause, as everyone understood that the chances of finding Ethan safe were directly tied to time. Yet as the day wore on without further decisive discoveries, a hard-to-accept reality gradually emerged. The large-scale search operation, despite being deployed with all available resources, could not fill the gaps that had appeared from the very first minutes of the case. Wide area sweeping helped eliminate many possibilities, but also exposed the limits of pure action without accurate data to guide it, leaving the urgent and comprehensive effort facing the risk of stalemate without new information. When wide-area search efforts failed to yield a decisive direction, the focus of the case had to shift back to human and visual data sources, seen as capable of partially filling the remaining gaps in the initial timeline. Though investigators were aware from the start of their inherent limitations, gathering additional witnesses was carried out more systematically, expanding beyond those directly present at Riverside Park when Ethan vanished, to include residents along adjacent streets, shop employees, park attendants, bus drivers, and anyone who might have seen a child alone during the suspected time frame. Each new witness approached carried the hope that a small detail, a seemingly unimportant memory, could become the missing piece, but the process quickly revealed a far more complex reality as statements began contradicting each other on both time and location. Some believed they saw a boy resembling Ethan near the park's northern exit, while others insisted they spotted a similar child near a bus stop on the opposite side, and there were accounts that only went as far as a vague feeling of maybe having seen without providing any identifying features. These contradictions did not necessarily stem from dishonesty, but reflected the natural limits of human memory in a crowded environment where hundreds of similar images pass by daily and easily blend together. Investigators had to analyze each statement in relation to the established timeline, trying to determine what could be independently verified, and what was merely unconscious speculation formed after the disappearance was widely publicized. Alongside witness canvassing, police conducted checks of security camera systems in the area in 1998, a task complicated both logistically and technically, due to the scattered and unsynchronized nature of surveillance devices at the time. Unlike modern digital systems, most cameras in public and private spaces then used analog tapes with low image quality, limited angles and short storage times, making data collection dependent on whether recordings still existed. Investigators had to approach each building, store and facility likely equipped with cameras, requesting reviews of footage from the relevant time frame, a time-consuming process with no guaranteed result. Even when some tapes were found, image quality was often insufficient to identify faces or specific features, especially in poor lighting or when subjects moved quickly through the frame. Moreover, the lack of a precise timestamp further diminished the footage's value, as a mere few-minute discrepancy could make reviewing hours of tape nearly impossible with limited resources. Investigators realized that 1998 surveillance technology was not designed to continuously track an individual across multiple spaces, especially a child without any identification device, imposing a hard limit on visual tracing. When tapes failed to provide a clear movement path, cross-referencing witness statements with camera data became even harder, as the two sources could not reinforce each other as initially hoped. Instead of narrowing the scope, these efforts generated multiple parallel scenarios, each with some credibility but none strong enough to become the primary investigative direction. There was no visual evidence of Ethan leaving the park by a specific vehicle, nor any witness statement reliable enough to confirm the boy followed an adult or moved independently along a certain route. The absence of a defined path forced investigators to acknowledge that, despite the number of witnesses approached and volume of visual data reviewed, they could not map the route Ethan took after vanishing from his mother's sight. It was during this phase that one of the case's greatest challenges became clear: processing a large volume of inconsistent information while lacking a strong data axis to organize it into a logical narrative. Investigators had to repeatedly revisit initial assumptions, adjust the timeline and search zones, but each adjustment introduced new possibilities, making the overall picture more complex rather than clearer. The combination of conflicting witnesses, limited camera data, and absence of overt violence signs created a particularly difficult investigative situation where no lead was strong enough to guide the entire effort in one direction. As witness and camera reviews reached their limits, authorities faced the reality that in an urban environment like New York, a child could disappear without leaving clear visual traces or reliable collective memory, and that failing to determine Ethan's movement path was not due to lack of effort, but a consequence of the interplay between technological limits, spatial characteristics, and the fragile nature of human memory in urgent moments. In the context where efforts based on witnesses and visual data failed to provide a clear movement path for Ethan Miller, authorities had to shift focus to identifying individuals potentially involved, a systematic step, but one fraught with risks, in a case lacking direct lead. The initial suspect list was compiled using broad criteria, including frequent park visitors at the time, individuals previously reported for approaching children in the area, and those with indirect ties to the Miller family or mentioned in witness statement. This process relied not just on investigative intuition, but strict regulations to avoid unfounded accusations, as each name added carried serious legal and social consequences. Investigators reviewed each subject's background, checking criminal records, residence, employment, schedule on the day Ethan disappeared, and any connection, however indirect, to the park or victim's family. In this process, some individuals were quickly cleared with clear alibis or mismatched statement details against the timeline, but others remained in a gray area where data was insufficient to fully confirm or rule out involvement. Background checks extended to residents in buildings near the park, workers at nearby stores, and even individuals flagged in unrelated but behaviorally similar cases, illustrating how broad the initial suspicion scope was in a lead-scarce case. However, delving deeper into files revealed that connections between potential suspects and Ethan were mostly speculative, based on spatial and temporal coincidences rather than direct evidence. Interrogations followed proper procedure, focusing on reconstructing each subject's schedule that day and cross-referencing with witness statements and available data, but most led to conclusions lacking weight to pursue further. Some suspects were cleared when their statements were independently verified, while others fell into insufficient evidence status, a familiar gray zone in missing persons cases where suspicion lingers but cannot translate into stronger action. The absence of direct evidence like fingerprints, clear images, or consistent witness accounts made narrowing the suspect list slow and cautious, as any mistake could miss a real lead or harm innocent. Investigators constantly weighed keeping a subject on the list for monitoring versus clearing them to focus resources elsewhere, a far from simple decision when foundational data was fragmented from the start. Through each review round, The suspect list gradually shortened not because a standout individual emerged, but because most initial subjects could not be concretely linked to the disappearance. This created a paradox in the investigation. Eliminating more people reduced directions, but did not correspondingly increase certainty in remaining ones. In internal evaluation meetings, veteran investigators began recognizing that this case did not fit familiar patterns of abductions or violent disappearances, where perpetrators often leave traces or suspicious behavior. Instead, everything pointed to Ethan leaving family oversight in a short window, too brief to draw attention but long enough to defy accurate reconstruction with available tools. As individual suspect directions hit dead ends, authorities had to narrow focus not by identifying a specific perpetrator, but by eliminating least likely scenarios, based on verified information. This narrowing brought no clear sense of progress. Rather, it highlighted the shortage of key pieces needed to advance the case. Investigators noted that at that point, all hypotheses existed only on paper, none strong enough to dominate, and the fragile balance between suspicion and lack of evidence left the investigation stalled. In this context, maintaining an increasingly short suspect list without breakthrough became a difficult puzzle, with limited resources and mounting pressure for results, forcing authorities to confront the reality that despite following all necessary procedures, Ethan Miller's disappearance had yet to reveal any clear sign leading to a definitive answer. As the investigative leads based on individual suspects gradually narrowed without yielding any clear breakthrough, the disappearance case of Ethan Miller began to be increasingly impacted by factors beyond purely professional scope, foremost among them, the unavoidable media pressure in a city like New York. Local news outlets continuously updated developments in the case, with Ethan's image appearing in print and on television, accompanied by short but repetitive descriptions, creating widespread attention while also simplifying a case that was already complex. The media demanded quick answers, while the actual investigation progressed slowly and cautiously, causing the gap between public expectations and the authorities' ability to respond to widen further. Alongside the pressure from the press was public opinion pressure. As the community began to question not only Ethan's fate, but also how the case was being handled, rumors emerged, ranging from hypotheses about family negligence to suspicions that police had missed something critical in the initial hours. These opinions, though not based on full information, spread rapidly and created a tense atmosphere where every investigative decision risked being scrutinized and interpreted negatively. Within the law enforcement agency, that pressure manifested through continuous evaluation meetings, where commanders had to weigh continuing to invest resources in a case without new leads against the need to allocate personnel to other cases, also demanding urgent attention. Some investigative decisions made in this context began to spark controversy, not because they were procedurally wrong, but because they reflected the unavoidable trade-offs between different priorities. Narrowing the search scope, temporarily suspending unproductive sweep operations, or reducing the frequency of public updates were all perceived as signs of backing down, even though in reality they were the result of reassessing resource efficiency. Those decisions directly affected the investigation team's morale, as the feeling of heading into a dead end became more evident with each passing day without significant new information. Time, considered a key factor in child disappearance cases, began to become the investigation's greatest enemy, because each day without new leads meant potential evidence faded further, witness memories became less accurate, and the ability to reconstruct events diminished exponentially. Resources allocated to the case, though maintained at a certain level, were no longer as abundant as in the early days, when urgency forced all units to prioritize it. Absolutely, search teams were scaled back, the number of investigators directly following the case gradually decreased, and many activities shifted to a state of waiting for new information rather than proactive tracing. In that context, the absence of new leads was not just a professional issue, but also a heavy psychological burden on those directly involved in the investigation, as each meeting ending without progress further reinforced the sense that prior efforts were gradually losing practical meaning. Internal reports reflected a concerning reality. Most investigative directions had been pursued to their reasonable limits, and continuing to repeat old steps without new data only consumed more time and resources, without increasing the chances of finding answers. This impasse did not occur suddenly but formed gradually, as each investigative option was considered, implemented, then eliminated, leaving an increasingly short list of possibilities that were neither proven nor disproven. Pressure from the victim's family, though not confrontation, also contributed to increasing the burden on decision-making, as each interaction reminded authorities that behind the reports and files was a real child who had vanished, and each day without answers was another day that family lived in uncertainty. Meanwhile, public attention began to show signs of shifting to other events, not because the case had been resolved, but because the news cycle did not allow a story without new developments to remain central for too long. This decline, while providing some quieter space for the investigation team, simultaneously reduced societal pressure to maintain high search intensity, creating a hard-to-break loop between lack of leads and lack of research. When investigators reviewed the entire process up to that point, they had to admit that, despite fully following necessary procedural steps, the case had not moved closer to a resolution, and that all available data had been exploited to the maximum. The impasse at this point was no longer a temporary feeling but a prolonged state, where each additional effort had to face questions about its actual effectiveness. In those circumstances, the absence of new leads was not merely a failure in information gathering, but a sign that Ethan Miller's disappearance was entering a different phase, where conventional investigative tools were no longer sufficient to create a breakthrough, and where pressure, time, and resource depletion converged, pushing the entire search process to the brink of an impasse that no one involved wanted but gradually had to accept. After a long period under pressure and stuck in an impasse without any new leads strong enough to change the investigative direction, the disappearance case of Ethan Miller gradually entered a different state, not through a sudden decision, but via a series of quiet adjustments in how authorities allocated time, personnel, and expectations. Active investigation, which had once been deployed with high intensity in the early days, began to slow as repeated sweep operations yielded no additional results, and proposals to expand the search scope continued to be delayed due to lack of foundational data to justify further resource use. In internal reports, the case was reassessed based on what had been achieved and what could not be achieved under current conditions, leading to the conclusion that all viable investigative directions using traditional methods had been exploited to a reasonable extent. On that basis, Ethan Miller's file was reclassified as an unsolved case, or cold case, an administrative term, but one with profound impact on how the case was handled from that point onward. This reclassification did not mean the case was completely closed, but it marked the shift from high priority status to a waiting state, where any subsequent actions depended on the emergence of new information from external sources, rather than continuous proactive efforts by investigators. Along with the change in file status was the gradual withdrawal of investigators who had been involved from the beginning, who were required to shift to handling other cases per unit assignments, leaving the file in the hands of specialized departments for archiving and monitoring cold cases with limited intervention. This personnel change not only disrupted the continuity of the investigative process, but also made many details existing only in the memories of initial participants difficult to fully convey through official records. Priority for the case was markedly lowered, as periodic evaluation meetings shifted from discussing search strategies to updating the status of no new developments, and file monitoring became one item on a long list of unsolved cases awaiting additional information. In a law enforcement environment with limited resources, this change was inevitable, but it also created a growing gap between the victim's family's hopes and the system's operational reality. Ethan's file was archived along with all collected documents, from statements, search reports, to suspect analyses and internal notes, forming a thick dossier that yielded no answers, fully reflecting the effort expended, but also exposing limits that could not be overcome at the time. In summary reports, the case was described with neutral phrases, emphasizing the lack of evidence, confirming specific criminal activity, no suspects qualifying for prosecution, and no indications that any investigative direction had been clearly overlooked, a phrasing that both protected professional procedures and indirectly acknowledged the lack of progress. For authorities, transitioning the case to cold case was a necessary step to maintain overall system efficiency, but for the Miller family, it was the moment they realized that the constant police presence, large-scale searches, and the sense that the case was being closely monitored had gradually become the path. Though there was no official statement implying closure, the change in pace and level of attention was undeniable, as updates became rarer, and familiar responses revolving around no new information, repeated with each contact. The case's lack of progress was not due to lack of effort, but because the tools available at the time were insufficient to penetrate the silence surrounding Ethan's disappearance. A silence formed by the absence of reliable witnesses, technological limitation, and the hard-to-trace nature of a disappearance in a crowded urban environment. When the cold case status was established, the case entered a static phase, where any movement depended on factors beyond investigators' direct control, such as the emergence of a new witness, a forgotten detail being recalled, or a technology that did not exist. Meanwhile, the files remained retained, not stamped as closed, but no longer the focus of daily operations, existing as a reminder of an unsolved case, rather than an actively pursued target. This transition closed the active investigation phase of Ethan Miller's disappearance, not with an answer, but with the acceptance that at that time, all viable paths had been traveled without reaching a conclusion, leaving a carefully preserved file standing still, awaiting a future moment that no one could predict. As Ethan Miller's file fell into a stagnant state within the system, elsewhere in the same city, the boy's life continued but in a completely different form, detached from the name, history and identity that once existed in the archive pages. The 5-year-old child who vanished from Riverside Park did not grow up as Ethan Miller in any official records, but lived under a different identity, a name not tied to a valid birth certificate, not verified by government agency and existing only within the narrow scope of those directly controlling his life. This new identity did not come with a clear origin story. It was used as a daily label sufficient for private interactions, but not enough to create a lasting administrative trace. The lack of legal documents soon became a pervasive feature, affecting every aspect of the boy's upbringing, from education and health care to access to basic services, forcing his life to operate in the gaps between regulations, where presence was informally accepted but never fully recognized. The living environment in which he grew up was highly controlled, not through overt violence but by strict limits imposed on movement range, relationships and information access, creating a miniaturized world where questions about the past were rarely encouraged and external connections were minimized. Those directly responsible for his daily life acted as comprehensive overseers, deciding when he could go out, whom he met, and in what contexts, shaping the concept of personal freedom from an early age within very narrow bounds. This control was not always expressed through clear commands or threats, but often disguised as protection or necessity, causing the boy to accept it as a natural part of life, though it gradually led to prolonged social isolation. His relationships with other children were restricted or interrupted, with no long-term bonds to peers, and social interactions often occurred in supervised settings, lacking the spontaneity characteristic of childhood. The lack of stable social contact not only affected his ability to form relationships, but also made it hard to build a sense of belonging, as every connection was temporary and easily severed without explanation. In that environment, his personal history existed as a collection of fragmented memories, not arranged in clear order and not confirmed by those around him, making understanding who he was and where he came from a question without an answer. Stories about the past, if any, were often vague or changed over time, inconsistent enough to form a stable identity, and the boy learned to accept that lack of clarity as inevitable. The absence of official records meant many important life milestones went unrecorded, from medical visits and vaccinations to educational phases, creating a prolonged void in any external effort to trace or confirm his existence. As he grew older, the lack of documentation was not just an administrative issue, but a practical barrier, limiting access to opportunities that peers took for granted, and forcing him to adapt to a life on the system's margins. In that context, signs of isolation were evident, not only in the scant number of relationships, but also in how he viewed the surrounding world, with constant caution and a tendency to avoid questions that might lead to unwanted answers. The lack of clarity about personal history did not cause an immediate shock but accumulated over the years, becoming a vague feeling that something in his life did not match what was told, though he lacked enough information to pinpoint that discrepancy precisely. Over the long period, the victim's life ran parallel to the cold case file lying dormant in storage, two realities never touching, each existing in its own silence. One a stagnant set of documents, the other a person growing up without access to his own history. It was this separation that highlighted the paradox of the case. While the system viewed it as an unsolved matter awaiting new information, for the victim, the loss lay not in being searched for or not, but in having to live through childhood and part of adulthood in a state of incomplete recognition, where identity existed only in private scope and was never confirmed by the outside world. Life under an unverified identity not only stripped the victim of his real name and personal history, but also shaped his entire childhood along a distorted trajectory, where experiences considered normal for children became fragmented, lacking continuity, and entirely dependent on circumstances. This disruption was most evident in his educational path, where attending school did not follow a stable or consistent route, but changed according to each life stage, each decision by the caregiver, and each level of risk acceptance on their part. There were periods when the victim had access to focused learning environments, but those phases were often short-lived, insufficient to form a continuous learning process or create lasting bonds with teachers and peers. The constant switching between different forms of education, sometimes homeschooling, sometimes informal classes, resulted in a patchwork knowledge base that was unsystematic and unvalidated by any educational standard. This instability not only affected his ability to absorb knowledge, but also interrupted the development of social skills inherently tied to the school environment, where children learn to interact, collaborate, and resolve conflicts within a structured framework. Alongside education, inconsistent medical records reflected another aspect of life on the margins of the system that the victim had to adapt to. Encounters with healthcare services, if they occurred, did not form a continuous chain documented under the same identity, leaving health history fragmented and impossible to fully track. Vaccinations, routine checkups, or treatments often took place under constrained conditions where verifying personal information was not prioritized, leading to critical data not being stored or unable to be cross-referenced later. This inconsistency increased the risk of missing potential health issues while reinforcing the habit of avoiding official systems, as each encounter carried the potential risk of questions about identity and origin. Meanwhile, the victim's social life developed in a confined space, where interactions with the outside world were limited both in quantity and depth. The lack of a stable communication environment meant friendships could not endure, and each change in living circumstances forced him to start over from scratch, if any interaction opportunities arose. These relationships were often superficial, lacking trust and attachment, because the victim was not placed in contexts that allowed natural intimacy or long-term sharing. The absence of social interaction not only impoverished his childhood experiences, but also influenced how he viewed himself in relation to others, as the feeling of being an outsider gradually became a familiar state. All these factors were reinforced by the reality that the victim had no official records confirming his existence in any system, education, healthcare, or administrative, making every step forward in life dependent on temporary solutions and the caregiver's flexibility. The lack of legal documents not only restricted access to basic services, but also created a prolonged state of uncertainty, where the future always hung in suspense due to unanswered questions about identity and right. In that context, dependence on the caregiver became the central factor shaping every aspect of life, from major decisions like residence and education, to small daily choices. The caregiver not only controlled material resources, but also held exclusive authority over information about the past, present, and potential future, creating a relationship in which the victim's autonomy was severely limited. This dependence, extending over many years, blurred the boundary between care and control, making it difficult for the victim to distinguish what was normal from unreasonable restriction. Without external reference points for comparison, those boundaries gradually became internalized, becoming part of how he understood the world and his place in it. Overall, the victim's childhood was not severed by a single event, but eroded step by step through prolonged instability in education, healthcare, and social relationships, all stemming from lack of official recognition in the system. These disruptions were not always manifested as obvious trauma, but they accumulated over time, creating a fragile foundation for maturation, where every skill, relationship, and milestone lacked the necessary continuity. That childhood passed like a series of disconnected segments, without a seamless flow for the victim to rely on in understanding who he was, where he came from, and where he belonged, leaving deep voids that would only much later have a chance to be confronted and named. The prolonged disruptions in childhood not only left consequences in education and social aspects, but gradually revealed a deeper issue as the victim entered a stage of clear awareness about his own existence in the surrounding world and began confronting the reality that he lacked a legal identity foundation like his peers. The absence of a birth certificate, rarely conscious to children in early years, became a clear barrier as administrative requirements appeared more frequently, from registering for school, accessing full healthcare services, to simple but verifying procedures like filling out personal information on official forms. The missing original documents not only caused specific obstacles, but also exposed a large void in how the victim was recorded by the system, with no paperwork proving date of birth, place of birth, or legal relationship to the caregiver. The resulting legal difficulties did not arise all at once, but accumulated gradually, as each closed administrative door reinforced the feeling that his existence was only accepted within narrow and temporary bounds. Every situation requiring identity verification became a challenge, forcing the victim to rely on alternative explanations or direct intervention by the caregiver, which not only limited autonomy but also made interactions with authorities or official organizations always carry underlying tension. In that process, doubts about origins began to form, not from any specific information but from the repetition of vague answers, inconsistent stories about the past, and avoidance when questions became more specific. What was told about birth circumstances, original family, or reasons for lacking legal papers changed over time, sometimes differing only in small details, but enough to create a sense that something did not align. This inconsistency existed not only in the caregiver's accounts, but also in the personal information the victim had to use in different contexts, as names, birth dates, or birthplaces were flexibly adjusted to fit situations, leading to prolonged hesitation about what was the correct information. Having to remember multiple versions of himself, even if not explicitly stated, created considerable psychological pressure, as personal identity was no longer obvious, but became a collection of context-dependent facts. The record gap present since early childhood became more apparent as the victim tried to compare his life to surrounding societal norms, where everyone could trace personal history through documents, school, medical or administrative records. This absence not only limited access to benefits, but also weakened the sense of self-continuity over time, as no documents confirmed important milestones had occurred. In those moments, the feeling of identity discrepancy was no longer abstract, but a concrete experience, as the victim realized his life story did not align with how the world operated and recorded people. Each confrontation with a verification procedure, each explanation of missing papers, reinforced doubts about origins, not with clear evidence, but with the absence of what should have existed. Inconsistent personal information gradually spread to other life aspects, as timelines, locations, and past details could not be placed in a unified sequence, making recounting his own story difficult and lacking confidence. This directly affected how the victim built relationships with others, as inability to share a clear origin story created invisible distance, making deep bonds hard to achieve. In that context, the record gap was not just administrative but became a void in self-perception, where basic questions about who he was and where he belonged lacked certain answers. This identity discrepancy did not explode into an immediate crisis, but developed quietly, gradually eroding confidence and inner security, as the victim lived with the awareness that his story was not fully recorded and could be challenged at any time. This state laid the groundwork for a long period of uncertainty, where identity was no longer an anchor, but a hanging question tied to every decision and interaction, and where every effort to integrate into normal life had to face the reality that his past had no clear place in systems built to record and protect people. While the victim grew up in a state of identity discrepancy and prolonged record gaps, in another parallel branch of the story, the Miller family never truly left the moment Ethan disappeared, even though the system had placed the case on hold and official investigations no longer proceeded with initial intensity. The search did not end with the police's administrative decision but shifted to a different form, persistent yet sporadic, where any new information, no matter how small, was received by the family with hope that it might lead to an overlooked clue. Laura and Daniel Miller maintained contact with those who had participated in the search, followed local news, preserved all information related to other child disappearances in the area, and continually compared those details to memories of their son. Though most comparisons only led to disappointment, as faith in the system's ability to find answers gradually waned, the family turned to external resources, hiring private investigators, in hopes that an independent perspective could uncover what the official investigation had missed. This did not happen just once, but over multiple phases, with different individuals approached, each bringing their own methods, but facing the same reality: stale records, lacking new data, and most leads exhausted years earlier. Nonetheless, the family continued investing time and money in these efforts, because stopping would mean accepting that nothing more could be done, a choice they were never truly ready to face. Over time, the financial burden of unofficial searching became evident, as costs for investigators, printing materials, travel, and related activities gradually drained family resources. Initial savings were used with the belief that this was a necessary investment to bring Ethan home, but as years passed without results, financial pressure became constant, affecting every major and minor decision in their lives. Alongside financial decline came profound changes in family relationships, as the initial shared grief gradually turned into different ways of coping with loss, creating hard-to-bridge gaps. Laura and Daniel, once united in goal and hope, began differing on how far to continue the search, whom to trust, and how much to sacrifice for an increasingly uncertain outcome. These differences, accumulating over time, did not always erupt into open conflict, but were enough to weaken their once strong bond, as each had to find their own way to live with the pain. Relationships with extended family and friends were also affected, as not everyone could sustain empathy and patience over years without progress, leading to a shrinking support circle and leaving the Millers increasingly isolated. Time, rather than easing the pain, prolonged it in a different form, as each passing year added no answers but only new layers of uncertainty, making it harder to distinguish hope from reality. Anniversaries, Ethan's birthday, and milestones that should have been celebrated became especially heavy times, reminding the family of what was lost and never found. Yet complete abandonment was never a clear option, as throughout those long years, the family still believed that continuing the search, even at lower intensity, kept their connection to their son alive. The fruitless prolongation of the search created a limbo state, where the family could neither move forward as if there had been closure, nor return to life as before Ethan's disappearance. This state influenced every major life decision, from residence and work to envisioning the future, as all plans were bracketed in waiting. Over many years, the search became part of the Miller family's identity, no longer just an action to find Ethan but a way to maintain meaning for what they had endured, despite the increasingly evident cost. Looking back at this entire period, it is clear that parallel to the victim's quiet life, the Miller family was also trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment, where prolonged time brought no answers but only deepened cracks in finances, emotions, and relationships, turning the search for Ethan from a specific goal into a prolonged state of existence that none of them had chosen but were forced to live with. After many years passing in the state of the family's unofficial search in the prolonged silence of the cold case file, a new element emerged, not from re-examining old clues, but from a fundamental change in how the system collects and processes biological data, opening up access possibilities that did not exist in the late 1990s. The DNA sample collection occurred in a context completely detached from the original disappearance, tied to the routine administrative or medical needs of an adult individual living under an incompletely verified identity, where leaving biological traces carried no investigative meaning, but was merely a technical procedure. This DNA sample was collected according to standard protocols, not linked to any specific criminal suspicion, and at that time, the provider themselves had no basis to connect this action to their own hazy past. Once collected, the biological sample was entered into the appropriate database per current regulations, becoming part of an ever-expanding information system that authorities used to cross-reference and verify identities in various contexts. Entering the data into the system did not create an immediate impact, as it simply added another new profile to the vast repository, where millions of other samples already existed without leading to any connection. However, It was precisely this quiet accumulation that made the difference, because when the database reached a sufficiently large scale, the ability to detect genetic links between individuals who had no knowledge of each other began to become feasible. In the system's routine operations, the automated comparison algorithm detected a level of genetic match exceeding the normal threshold, not between two individuals directly, but between the newly entered DNA sample and a distant relative's profile already existing in the prior data. This discovery was not conclusive, but sufficient to be flagged as anomalous, as the degree of similarity indicated the likely existence of a blood relationship that the system had never officially recorded. At that very moment, an alert was triggered in the system, elevating this information to a higher processing level, where genetic data specialists manually reviewed to determine whether the match could be explained by known family relationships or not. When common possibilities were ruled out, attention began shifting toward less common scenarios, including the possibility that an individual was linked to a missing person case or an unresolved identity matter. The system alert was not merely a technical notification, but a signal that the newly collected biological data might connect to a story that had never been closed. Even though this link remained vague and required careful verification, information about the relative match was forwarded through internal channels per protocol, accompanied by preliminary analyses of the similarity level and possible assumptions, creating a new processing chain whose focus was no longer the crime scene or witnesses, but genetic data and what it could reveal about the past. When Ethan Miller's name reappeared in this context, not as a new victim or a recalled clue, but as a cold case file matching the criteria related to the genetic match, the case began shifting away from its prolonged static state. The file was transferred to the cold case unit, where cases thought to be closed are re-examined in the light of modern technology and data, marking a significant shift in approach. This transfer did not mean the case was immediately reopened, but was the first step in a re-evaluation process, where specialists and investigators had to determine whether the DNA discovery had sufficient reliability and relevance to justify reallocating resources. In that process, Ethan's entire old file was reviewed at an overview level, not to search for overlooked clues, but to cross-reference with the new genetic information and assess the potential connection between two data streams that previously had no opportunity to intersect. The emergence of DNA in this context did not resemble a dramatic immediate breakthrough, but rather a weak yet clear signal, enough to break the case's prolonged silence and force the system to respond. Notably, the entire initial process occurred with almost no direct human intervention, as the pre-designed algorithms and alert thresholds were what first recognized the potential link, reflecting a fundamental change in how justice can be activated in the era of big data. When the information reached the cold case unit, the Ethan Miller case was no longer just an old file gathering dust on a storage shelf, but became a case with a new signal needing review in a modern context, where biological data has the ability to bridge fragments that decades of traditional investigation could not connect. Although no conclusions were reached at that point, the appearance of DNA had created a quiet but decisive turning point, shifting the focus from passive waiting to the possibility of action based on scientific evidence, and opening a new phase in the journey to find the truth, originating not from human memory or physical traces, but from the inescapable genetic structure of the human body. From the DNA signal that had just appeared in the system, the investigation entered a completely different phase, where the focus was no longer on the scene or witnesses but on reconstructing blood relationships through genetic data, starting with building a genealogy tree detailed enough to explain the detected match. DNA analysis specialists proceeded to break down the degree of genetic similarity into specific relationship possibilities, estimating generational distance and determining which family branch the connection most likely fell into, thereby creating a preliminary genealogy framework based on statistical probabilities rather than available personal information. This process required combining biological data with public and semi-public information sources to turn abstract numbers into real individuals in the outside world, each representing a possible branch in the gradually forming genealogy tree. As the genealogy branches expanded, the pool of potential subjects was quickly narrowed by excluding individuals who did not meet basic criteria, such as age incompatible with the disappearance timeline, gender inconsistent with biological assumptions, or migration history making involvement unlikely. This narrowing did not happen in one go, but was an iterative process, with each analysis rounds eliminating more unviable branches while clarifying the bloodlines needing priority attention. Parallel to refining the genealogy tree, population data was systematically cross-referenced, including civil registry records, residency data, movement information, and scattered administrative traces that might exist even if the individual lacked full legal identity. This cross-referencing aimed to determine whether any individuals in the potential genealogy branches had lived, moved, or disappeared from the system at times consistent with Ethan Miller's disappearance, thereby seeking intersections between genetic data and real-world population flows. The specialist recognized that not every genetic connection led to a clear answer, as many genealogy branches could be interrupted by data gaps, especially in cases involving migration, name changes, or avoidance of administrative systems. Nevertheless, these very gaps became important indicators, as they reflected anomalies consistent with the history of an individual who had lived outside official paperwork. As layers of data were overlaid, the scoping range gradually narrowed, not only in terms of bloodlines, but also geographically, as the most fitting individuals all had some connection to the New York area or nearby regions during the key year. Scoping suitable individuals did not aim to determine a final conclusion immediately, but to create a short list of cases with the highest probability, each evaluated based on the overlap between genetic data, population information, and critical timeline. In this process, investigators had to continually balance breadth and depth of analysis, as narrowing too quickly risked missing low data branches that could be decisive, while expanding too much diluted resources and prolonged processing time. Each advance in scoping was accompanied by assessing data reliability, not only considering DNA sample quality, but also the completeness and accuracy of supporting information sources, since a strong genetic link based on flawed population data could lead to wrong conclusions. The analysis specialist had to work in a state of balance between statistical probabilities and real-life realities, understanding that genetic genealogy is not a perfect map, but an orientation tool, needing to be used with the utmost caution. In that context, each scoped individual was not viewed as a suspect or conclusion, but as a potential intersection between past and present, where data might or might not lead to the ultimate truth. Assessing reliability became the key step, as investigators had to determine whether what they were seeing was a strong enough signal to pursue further, or merely a statistical coincidence without real meaning. Through multiple rounds of analysis and cross-referencing, the genealogy tree gradually stabilized with several branches marked for priority, reflecting the highest fit with the set criteria, while eliminating most other possibilities. This process did not bring absolute certainty, as the nature of genetic genealogy always involves error probabilities, but it created a scientific foundation solid enough to justify continuing to invest investigative resources. When the phase of building and evaluating the genetic genealogy concluded, the Ethan Miller case had been placed in a completely new reference framework, where identity was no longer a vague concept based on memories or lost documents, but became a data problem that could be approached, verified, and gradually narrowed using modern tools. Although there was no final answer yet, this process had clarified one important thing, that after decades of silence, human genetic structure has the ability to reconnect life paths thought to be permanently separate, and that carefully evaluating each connection is the necessary step to ensure any future conclusions are based on the most reliable foundation possible. From the genetic genealogy foundation that had been built and evaluated to the necessary level of reliability, the 1998 disappearance file of Ethan Miller was brought back to the desk, not as an old set of documents to be reread from scratch, but as a data system to be cross-referenced in parallel with the newly emerged information to determine where the past and present might align. investigators began by systematically comparing old and new data, placing information gathered during the initial investigation phase alongside the DNA analysis and genetic genealogy results, to see if any details once considered unimportant or unclear now carried different meaning when viewed from the new perspective. This process did not aim to find faults, simply, but to understand how limitations in technology, resources, and awareness in 1998 had shaped the investigative decisions at that time, thereby assessing whether those decisions remained valid in the context of modern data. As witness statements, search reports, and suspect analyses were reviewed again, some initial oversights gradually emerged, not as procedural violations, but as inevitable consequences of having to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and significant time pressure. Estimated timelines, once accepted as reasonable bases for scoping searches, were now re-examined with greater caution, as genetic data indicated the possible existence of an individual fitting the case, but outside the geographic or social ranges previously prioritized. Re-evaluating investigative decisions also included examining the assumptions that had driven the initial direction, such as how the criminal risk level of the incident was determined, or prioritizing certain disappearance scenarios over others, based on the social context of the time. In the light of new data, investigators realized that some assumptions once seen as reasonable may have inadvertently narrowed the scope too early, causing less common possibilities to not be pursued fully. This process led to identifying some overlooked points, not due to lack of competence or carelessness, but because they did not fit the common investigative models of the late 1990s, when tracing technology and data linking capabilities were limited. These points included indirect connections, unremarkable record gaps, or individuals who left no clear administrative traces and thus could not be effectively added to watch lists. When investigators cross-referenced those overlooked points with the constructed genetic genealogy tree, some seemingly disparate details began forming a more structured picture, showing that the new data did not just add information, but changed the understanding of what had occurred. Reopening the file did not occur as a complete rejection of the old investigation process, but as an adjustment, where conclusions once viewed as final were now placed back in temporary status, ready to be re-verified with modern tools. Updating the investigative direction became the necessary next step, as investigators determined that continuing to cling to old hypotheses would not leverage the value of the new genetic data, while opening alternative approaches could illuminate aspects never fully considered. This updating process included adjusting criteria for scoping individuals, re-examining movement timelines, and social connections in the early years after Ethan's disappearance, and reassessing the relevance of record gaps, once seen as secondary. Investigators had to work in a state of balance between respecting prior efforts and being willing to acknowledge that new data might lead to different conclusions, a challenge not only professionally, but also in mindset. In internal discussions, reopening the file was viewed as a rare opportunity to connect 2 points in time more than 2 decades apart, where unanswered questions from 1998 could be reposed more accurately, thanks to advances in science and data management. Although no final conclusions were reached at this point, comparing old and new data had created a significant shift in the case approach, from accepting the limitations of the past to actively exploiting the new possibilities of the present. When the review and investigative direction update process concluded, the Ethan Miller file was no longer merely an old set of documents being reread, but had become a living file, where each detail was placed in dynamic relation to the new data, ready for the next steps based on the combination of traditional investigative experience and the analytical power of modern science. From the significant adjustments in the direction of the investigation after the 1998 case file was reopened, the next decisive step was the shift from indirect analysis to direct confirmation, beginning with the purposeful collection of a DNA sample from the individual most closely matching the constructed genetic pedigree. This process was carried out under strict procedures to ensure absolute legality and reliability of the results, as any error at this stage could collapse the entire investigative foundation rebuilt over many years. The direct DNA sample was obtained under controlled conditions, with supervision by experts and full identity verification procedures in place, even though that identity remained provisional and not yet officially recognized. After collection, the sample was sent to an independent laboratory for matching against relevant genetic data, including relative profiles already in the system as well as archived samples from the Miller family collected in the past. The matching process went beyond simply looking for a basic match. It involved analyzing the degree of similarity across multiple genetic markers to rule out random coincidence and establish blood relation with the highest possible accuracy. When the analysis results were returned, the indicators showed a level of compatibility far exceeding the threshold of doubt, sufficient to confirm that the tested individual had a direct blood relation to the Miller family, moving from the realm of probabilistic ambiguity to scientific confirmation. These results were reviewed by multiple levels of expertise, from genetic specialists to legal advisors, to ensure that the interpretation of the data was unbiased and aligned with current evidentiary standards. On that basis, the legal confirmation process was initiated, a necessary step to transform the scientific conclusion into official recognition within the administrative and judicial system. This confirmation required coordination among relevant agencies, including cross-referencing the DNA results with the 1998 missing person file, evaluating data continuity, and determining that no cases of name duplication or identity confusion could otherwise explain the result. Once the legal requirements were met, the individual's identity was officially confirmed as Ethan Miller, ending decades of existing in a gray area across systems. Along with the legal confirmation came the updating of official records, where all related data was adjusted to reflect the newly established truth, from the missing person file and cold case database to relevant identity management system. This update was not merely technical but carried profound symbolic meaning, as it marked the first time since 1998 that Ethan Miller was fully recorded again in systems that had left his name blank for so long. With the procedures completed, the question was no longer whether the individual was Ethan, but how this information would be conveyed to those who had waited over 2 decades for an answer. The notification to the Miller family was prepared carefully, involving investigators, psychologists, and legal representatives to ensure the information was delivered as accurately and humanely as possible. That moment was not approached as an investigative triumph, but as the end of a prolonged period of uncertainty, where the family finally received confirmation that the child they had lost was not only alive, but had existed all those years under a different name. The notification did not come with all the answers they had hoped for, but it provided a certainty they had lacked for years, replacing speculation and fragile hope with a verified truth. For the system, the identity confirmation closed a loop stretching from 1998 to the present, shifting the case from a search status to one of establishment, where the question of who had been answered by scientific and legal evidence. However, in that very moment, the complexity of the case became clearer than ever, as confirming identity did not mean resolving all the consequences of the past. It was merely the foundation for directly confronting new reality. As the information was officially recorded and conveyed to the family, the Ethan Miller case entered a different phase, where the truth was no longer shrouded in doubt, but the impacts of over 20 years of disappearance remain, awaiting understanding and resolution in the next chapters of the story. After Ethan Miller's identity was confirmed, both scientifically and legally, the next step no longer belonged to laboratories or administrative files, but shifted to an entirely different space, where real people had to directly confront the results of over 2 decades of separation, starting with organizing the first meeting between Ethan and his biological family. Arranging the reunion was done cautiously, not as a spontaneous or purely symbolic moment, but as a tightly controlled process, to minimize psychological harm to all involved parties. The meeting location was chosen to ensure privacy and safety, avoiding external influences that could distort emotions or add unnecessary pressure, while the timing and form of contact were considered based on psychologists' assessments of each person's readiness. Although blood relation had been confirmed on paper, reconnecting on a human level was an entirely different challenge, as over 20 years of separation had created individuals with distinct memories, experiences and identities that could not be bridged simply by a scientific conclusion. When the meeting took place, the actual reactions of those involved did not follow a simple emotional script. Joy and relief coexisted with confusion, caution, and even unnamed silences as faces familiar from old photos confronted an adult stranger. For the Miller family, That moment was both confirmation that their long wait had finally been answered, and a confrontation with the reality that the child they once knew no longer existed in his former form. Instead, there was an individual with a history and experiences they had not shared. For Ethan, the meeting was not just the return of a name, but a direct collision between his current identity and the newly confirmed biological origin, where concepts of family, memory, and belonging had to be reorganized in a very short time. The intervention of experts played a key role in shaping how the reunion unfolded, not to create an emotional climax, but to ensure that all reactions, positive or negative, were acknowledged and handled safely. Psychologists closely monitored interactions, assisting in setting boundaries, managing expectations, and explaining that prolonged separation could not be overcome immediately, no matter how strong the desire. They emphasized that blood relation, though an undeniable foundation, does not automatically translate into emotional bonding without time and mutual understanding. In that context, the reunion was not seen as the end of the journey but as the beginning of a longer process, where the parties had to learn to rebuild relationships under entirely different conditions from those that had been interrupted. The presence of media, though minimized in the initial phase, was an unavoidable factor as the story was confirmed and began attracting widespread attention, turning a deeply personal event into a case of public interest. Balancing individual privacy with society's need for information became a difficult equation, as every image or piece of information released could affect the psychological adjustment of those just reunited. Authorities and the family had to coordinate to determine the scope of shared information, striving to ensure the story was not reduced to a single touching moment, but understood as a complex process, with multiple layers of emotion and consequence. In the hours and days following the meeting, the parties' reactions continued to evolve, as initial emotions gave way to deeper thoughts about the meaning of reunion and what it demanded for the future. There was no immediate consensus on how the relationship would be maintained or developed, as each person carried different expectations, shaped by over 20 years in completely separate circumstances. The reunion thus did not resemble a moment that closed a tragedy, but rather the opening of a new chapter, with its own challenges, where the truth had been confirmed, but living with that truth required effort and time. As the parties left the first meeting, no one could claim everything had become easier, but at least the silence that had lasted for years was broken, replaced by a concrete reality they were forced to face. It was in that complexity that Ethan Miller's reunion with his family was not defined by a single emotional reaction, but by the slow, challenging process of learning to re-examine the past, present, and the connections between them. While the outside world began to realize that finding a missing person after more than 2 decades was not just a story of survival, but also a story of what happens after the moment called return. Immediately after the reunion took place, and the initial emotions subsided enough to ensure psychological safety for all parties, the focus of the case returned to the core unfinished task of the justice system, determining criminal responsibility related to Ethan Miller's disappearance over 2 decades earlier. The post-reunion investigation did not start from scratch, but it could not continue along old paths either, as the legal, social, and evidentiary context had changed profoundly since 1998. Requiring a cautious and selective approach. Investigators traced individuals connected to the period when Ethan disappeared in the subsequent years, focusing on those who had control, supervision, or direct influence over his life during the early years under a different identity. This tracing involved re-examining previously recorded relationships, cross-referencing them with newly collected data from the genetic pedigree and updated files, to determine if any individuals once on the periphery of the case now warranted closer attention in the new context. Concurrently, new statements were gathered, not only from the Miller family or Ethan himself, but also from those who had contact with, supported, or lived near the caregiver during various periods. These statements, while carrying certain informational value, faced major challenges regarding accuracy, as time had faded memories, altered perceptions, and made many details hard to verify. Investigators had to continually distinguish between direct recollection, later formed inferences, and what could be corroborated by documents or independent data. In the process, some new information emerged sufficient to fill in the overall picture, but it rarely reached the level of specificity needed to become direct evidence of criminal conduct. Evaluating prosecutability became the focus of discussions between investigators and prosecutors, where the question was not just whether someone should be held accountable, but whether the system had enough legal grounds to bring the case to trial after so many years. Legal barriers became apparent, including statutes of limitations for certain offenses, the absence of physical evidence eroded by time, and the difficulty of fitting many actions, though ethically wrong, into the criminal framework applicable at the time. Retroactive application of laws was strictly limited, forcing prosecutors to carefully weigh the desire for justice against the risk of pursuing a prosecution without solid legal foundation. Additionally, the lack of decisive evidence became central, as there was no direct physical proof linking a specific individual to abduction or unlawful detention in the early years, and statements, though more consistent than before, still fell short of the proof threshold required in a criminal trial. Investigators had to face the reality that DNA, while pivotal in confirming Ethan's identity, did not automatically provide evidence of how and under what circumstances he was removed from his former life, or the intent and actions of those involved. In internal reviews, the case was dissected from multiple angles, from the viability of charging various offenses, to determining if any conduct could be addressed through civil law or alternative legal measures, but each option faced its own limitations. This complexity not only reflected the technical difficulties of a decades-old case, but also highlighted the gap between establishing historical truth and achieving justice in the legal sense. While some in the system wanted to push the investigation harder for any prosecutorial opportunity, others were more cautious, concerned that pursuing a weakly evidenced case could cause further harm to those already deeply affected. The post-reunion investigation thus unfolded in tension between two goals: clarifying responsibility and preserving the integrity of the legal process. Through each step of tracing and information gathering, it became clear that time had created an almost impenetrable wall for many key questions. With physical traces gone, witnesses unable to recall accurately, and the legal context significantly altered. This forced investigators to reconsider the meaning of continuing a purely criminal pursuit, while still fulfilling the duty to fully record and archive any new information. As the post-reunion investigation phase approached its practical limit, the Ethan Miller case faced a hard-to-accept but undeniable reality: that recovering the victim after more than 2 decades did not equate to fully holding anyone accountable, and that in some cases, legal justice could not keep pace with the truth confirmed by science and evidence. After additional investigative efforts reached their practical limits, and the possibility of prosecution was no longer clear, the focus of the case shifted away from the question of who should bear criminal responsibility to concentrating on the long-term consequences that more than 2 decades of disappearance had left for Ethan Miller himself and those involved, beginning with the process of adjusting identity within the legal and social systems. Restoring identity is not limited to simply recording the correct name in records, but is a complex series of procedures aimed at merging the interrupted past with the ongoing present, including reissuing or creating new necessary legal documents, adjusting information in various databases, and resolving conflicts arising from the existence of multiple identities in the same person. This process requires coordination among multiple agencies and often proceeds more slowly than expected, as each step must ensure absolute accuracy to avoid creating new legal issues, making the confirmation of identity, though completed scientifically, still an ongoing administrative challenge. Parallel to the legal adjustments is the need for psychological therapy, as both Ethan and the Miller family must confront the complex emotional reactions arising after reunion. Not just joy or relief, but also a sense of loss for the years that have passed, confusion about roles and relationships, and accumulated traumas that have never been fully addressed. Therapy does not aim to erase painful memories or quickly create bonding, but focuses on helping the parties understand and accept that their reactions are the natural consequence of a prolonged abnormal experience, while providing tools for them to communicate and establish healthy boundaries in the new relationship that is forming. Ethan's process of social reintegration also poses many challenges, as transitioning from a life on the margins of the system to a fully recognized position requires not only legal paperwork, but also the ability to adapt to societal expectations and norms that he had never previously had to face. Social interactions, from the workplace to personal relationships, all carry invisible pressure to explain the past, confront others' curiosity, and self-define within a story that the public already knows in part. In that context, personal difficulties do not appear as isolated events, but as a continuous chain of challenges, from building trust with biological family, adjusting expectations about relationships, to dealing with the feeling of being both a victim and a survivor, a psychological state that easily leads to internal conflicts. The Miller family also faces their own difficulties, as finding Ethan again does not automatically close the wounds they have endured, but sometimes revives emotions suppressed for many years, forcing them to learn to live with a reality different from the one they had nurtured during the years of searching. In that context, long-term support becomes a key factor, not only in the form of professional psychological intervention, but also through social, legal, and community support programs aimed at helping Ethan and the family gradually stabilize their lives. These supports are designed to address both immediate needs and potential future issues, from legal counseling on rights and obligations to resources for building social and professional skills. However, the effectiveness of support cannot be measured in the short term, as recovery from an experience lasting decades requires patience and flexibility, as well as acceptance that not all wounds can be fully healed. In that process, the boundary between legal and psychological becomes blurred, as administrative decisions can trigger strong emotional reactions, and psychological progress can affect the ability to complete legal procedure. Identity adjustment, therapy, and reintegration therefore do not occur in a linear sequence, but intertwine and influence each other, forming a complex process that needs ongoing monitoring and support. As time passes after the reunion, it becomes clear that the consequences of the disappearance do not end with finding the victim or confirming identity, but continue to shape the lives of those involved in subtle and long-lasting ways. The truth has been established, but living with that truth requires sustained effort from both individuals and the system, where success is not measured by closing a file, but by the ability to create conditions for those affected to build a stable and meaningful life in the present, even though their past can never be rewritten. After Ethan Miller's identity was fully confirmed scientifically and legally, the case was officially recorded as resolved, in the most basic sense of the term, as the central question that had haunted for more than 2 decades, who Ethan is and where he is, had a clear and irreversible answer. However, that very moment of confirmation revealed a profound paradox of modern justice, where the truth about identity was clarified, but the question of criminal responsibility could not reach a commensurate conclusion. The fact that the perpetrator was not prosecuted was not the result of indifference or lack of determination from the system, but a direct consequence of time, insurmountable legal barriers, and the absence of decisive evidence that no additional investigative effort could compensate for. In that context, the case was left in a suspended state, resolved in terms of identification, but never closed in the sense of complete criminal justice. Legal responsibility thus became an unacceptable but unavoidable void, as the actions leading to Ethan's disappearance could not be reliably prosecuted in court, either due to statutes of limitations, changes in the law over the periods, or the fact that physical evidence no longer existed after so many years. What remained was a chain of reasonable inferences based on genetic data, delayed testimonies, and record gaps, sufficient to paint a convincing picture of what had happened, but not enough to meet the strict proof standards of a criminal trial. For the Miller family, the solved but unresolved status carried a particularly heavy meaning, as they had to accept that finding their son did not mean those responsible would pay the price before the law, and that the system's official recognition stopped at identity rather than extending to justice in the way they had imagined during the many years of searching. The feeling of incomplete justice did not appear as a sudden shock, but gradually formed as non-prosecution decisions were made cautiously and with clear legal basis, yet still left a taste of infection, where truth was confirmed without accompanying punishment or proportional accountability. For Ethan, this status placed him in an indefinable position, as he was both living proof that a crime had occurred and someone who did not receive the legal closure that society often associates, thus the concept of justice. The absence of a trial or verdict did not erase what he had experienced, but it blurred the boundary between being recognized as a victim and being fully protected by the legal system. In the public space, Ethan Miller's story was retold as a success of science and modern data, but also as a reminder that technology cannot by itself compensate for the gaps created by time in the structure of justice. The authorities in recording the case in this were forced to use cautious language, emphasizing that there was no sufficiently strong legal basis to proceed with prosecution, even though the identity confirmation had eliminated all doubt about Ethan having been removed from his old life against the family's will. That caution, though necessary to protect the integrity of the law, contributed to increasing the feeling that justice had stopped midway, not due to lack of truth, but due to lack of a legal path to turn that truth into accountability. In the solved but unresolved state, the Ethan Miller case became a typical example of the system's limits when facing cases spanning decades, where evidence standards designed to protect everyone's rights also make pursuing accountability impossible in some circumstances. This sense of incompleteness existed not only at the personal level but also spread to the societal level, as the public was forced to confront the question of whether finding the truth is enough to call it justice, or whether justice requires additional elements that are not always achievable. When the case was officially recorded with this dual status, it did not close with a neat period, but with a prolonged silence, where what had been resolved and what remained open coexisted. That very parallelism makes Ethan Miller's story not just a case of someone found after many years, but a reminder of the unavoidable limits of human justice, where identity confirmation can be done with precise science, but restoring a full sense of fairness depends on conditions that time sometimes does not allow. From the solved but unresolved state of the Ethan Miller case, looking back at the entire process is no longer just about explaining the fate of one individual, but expands into a system evaluation, where what happened is placed in the context of procedures, technology, and law from the late 90s. The initial procedural errors, when re-examined, do not appear as clear personal mistakes or intentional negligence, but as consequences of the common investigative approach at that time, where early classification of a missing person case based on initial risk assessment could lead to narrowing the search scope too quickly. Heavy reliance on witness statements in a crowded urban environment, where memories are easily distorted, combined with the lack of real-time data cross-referencing tools, caused key timelines not to be established firmly enough, creating gaps that could not later be filled. In retrospect, it can be seen that some decisions made under high time pressure inadvertently excluded less common scenarios, not because they were unreasonable, but because they did not fit the familiar investigative models of the era. These limitations became even clearer when placed in the context of 1998 technology, when surveillance camera systems were fragmented, low quality and not integrated, population data was scattered across agencies, and DNA was not yet used as a mass identity tracing tool. The absence of centralized databases and cross-disciplinary analysis capabilities made connecting scattered pieces of information nearly impossible, especially in cases without clear physical traces. Under those conditions, a child disappearing from public space without leaving a determinable trail was not unusual, but a scenario accurately reflecting the technical limitations of the era. Parallel to technological limitations were legal gaps, as the legal framework in place at the end of the 20th century was not designed to effectively handle cases of identity deprivation or existence outside the system for extended period. Regulations on record storage, data sharing between agencies, and statutes of limitations, though aimed at protecting individual rights and legal stability, inadvertently created barriers, difficult to overcome when truth was only discovered after decades. In the Ethan Miller case, these gaps were evident in the lack of sufficiently flexible legal mechanisms to pursue accountability when evidence appeared late, even though the nature of the act had been identified at moral and social level. The system evaluation therefore does not stop at the question, who did wrong, but extends to, was the system designed to handle situations like this? And the answer in many aspects is no. However, from those limitations, important investigative lessons were drawn, not just for one case, but for the entire approach to long-term missing persons cases. One of the clearest lessons is the importance of preserving data, even if it seems to have no immediate value, because what cannot be used now may become the key in the future when technology and methods change. Additionally, the recognition that maintaining open files, allowing periodic re-evaluation of unsolved cases, is not just procedural, but vital to prevent cases like Ethan's from being permanently buried in archives. The case also emphasizes the value of dedicated cold case units, where traditional investigative experience is combined with modern analytical tools, creating the ability to reconnect broken information threads. At the same time, it raises the need to reconsider legal frameworks, to adapt to the reality that truth can appear very late, and the system needs appropriate responses without harming core principles of justice. In overall evaluation, the Ethan Miller case becomes a typical example of the intersection between human effort and structural limits, where what was achieved and what could not be achieved coexist in a complex picture. Looking back does not aim to deny past effort, but to better understand how procedural, technological, and legal factors shape the outcome, thereby creating a knowledge base to help the system respond better to similar cases in the future, where time is no longer an absolute barrier to seeking truth and protecting people. From evaluating the entire investigative system and the limitations revealed through the Ethan Miller case, the final picture that emerges is not one of a perfectly closed story, but a clear testament to the fundamental change in how modern society approaches truth, justice, and collective memory, with modern DNA playing a central role in that shift. DNA technology, which only existed in experimental form in the late 1990s, has proven its ability to transcend time in a way that human memory, physical evidence, or administrative records cannot, becoming the only tool capable of connecting a missing child to his true identity after more than 2 decades living outside the system. In this case, DNA was not just scientific evidence, but a bridge between a fractured past and a present trying to redefine itself, showing that biological truth can persist silently, unerased by time, waiting for the moment the system is capable of hearing it. However, DNA's role only truly shines when placed in an appropriate organizational structure, and that is where the significance of cold case units becomes clearer than ever. Cold case units are not merely storage places for old cases, but specialized spaces for reconnecting data, experience, and technology, allowing files thought to be frozen to be reapproached with methods that did not previously exist. In Ethan Miller's case, the existence of a dedicated unit with the ability to revisit old files in the light of genetic data and modern analysis turned a faint signal in the system into a purposeful chain of actions, leading to identity confirmation and breaking the silence that had lasted many years. The social significance of the case thus extends beyond the fate of one individual or family, as it raises questions about how the community remembers, forgets, and sometimes rediscovers cases once considered hopeless. This story reminds us that every cold case file is not just a stack of papers, but a life continuing somewhere, possibly unrecognized, inadequately protected, but still existing in the gaps the system leaves. Ethan Miller's return, though not accompanied by complete legal closure, created significant social impact by reviving belief that time does not have to be the end of truth, and that scientific advances, if used responsibly, can open opportunities for cases once considered permanently unsolvable. At the same time, the case also conveys clear preventive messages, not didactic but drawn from the very gaps that led to the tragedy. In crowded urban environments, where a sense of safety is sometimes built on familiarity and habit, just one moment of inattention can create lifelong consequences, and relying entirely on the assumption that the crowd will protect each other can be a dangerous mistake. At the system level, this story emphasizes the importance of storing and preserving data, even when it has no clear value at the time of collection, because what is deemed unimportant today may become the key tomorrow. It also shows the need to continuously update legal and procedural frameworks to keep pace with the reality that truth can appear very late, and the system needs enough flexibility to respond without harming core justice principles. For society in general, the Ethan Miller case is a reminder that finding a missing person is not just a success of science or investigation, but a collective responsibility in supporting those individuals to reintegrate, adjust identity, and continue living with what has been lost. It affirms that justice does not always come in the form of a verdict, but can still exist as recognition, support, and relentless effort to minimize prolonged trauma. Looking back at the entire journey from that afternoon in 1998 at Riverside Park to the moment identity was confirmed more than 20 years later, This story does not close with a complete answer to every question, but with a deeper understanding of the limits and capabilities of humans in seeking truth. In the intersection of modern DNA, cold case units, and changing social awareness, the Ethan Miller case becomes a milestone, not because it is perfect, but because it shows that even in cases of incomplete justice, relentless searching, remembering, and learning can still create meaning, not just for those involved, but for how society confronts losses that have never been fully explained. The Ethan Miller story illustrates a very American but extremely practical lesson for life in the United States today. Safety and identity cannot rely solely on the community's sense of peace, but must be based on processes, data, and preventive habits. The Miller family in the Upper West Side believed that Riverside Park was safe because it was crowded, so when Laura stopped for a moment to organize her bag and Ethan ran farther than usual, it was enough to create a gap of a few minutes, and that gap became the blind spot that police could not reconstruct, especially with conflicting witness statements and low-quality 1998 analog cameras that could not determine the path. The first lesson for American families today is set a clear alert threshold in public places. For example, 30-60 seconds of lost sight of young children means react immediately. Agree on rules like stay put, find someone in uniform, don't go with strangers, and teach children to memorize phone numbers, addresses, or at least parents' names. Second, treat identity as a safety layer. Keep the most recent photo of your child on your phone. Note identifying features, scars, teeth, birthmarks, and consider appropriate tech options like kids' watches with GPS when going to parks or taking trains. Third, the story reminds adults that data can save lives. Ethan was found thanks to DNA and genetic genealogy after 22 years, meaning families should systematically store important records, documents, photos, medical files, and if misfortune occurs, provide accurate information right from the start to avoid distorted timelines, like in this case. Finally, a humane attitude is needed. Reunion is not a simple happy ending. It involves therapy, reintegration, and long-term support. That's how a modern community protects survivors after the gaps the system once missed. If you find the Ethan Miller story makes you think about safety, identity, and gaps that can exist for many years, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following and analyzing other real cases together. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video with another cold case where the truth may have been sleeping, but it has never disappeared.